Hey guys, and we're back with another episode of How High the Moon. What are we on? Like 7, 18, 19? I don't know. I'll have to check. Always get it wrong. Anyways, our friend Ella made it back home to Alkaloo, South Carolina. So, she made it back home. She got to see Henry and Granny and Grandpa. I don't know that she saw Myrna. I don't remember that off the top of my head. We did notice a couple things, right? Like some changes in Ella. Number one, like she used to like idolize her mom, like her mom could do no wrong. And she's kind of seeing her mom a little bit more for who she is right now. And didn't hold her mom to the highest esteem. So that was different. That was something new that happened. The other thing that happened was on the train, she overheard some people talking, and George Steiny, her friend, has been accused of murder. So she doesn't know very much. She did ask Granny about it, and Granny basically was like, something's going on, but we don't know anything. Mind your own business, kind of in a way. So we know that's happening. We also noticed that Henry was a little bit more quiet and reserved. So he was so excited to have Ella back, though, which was terrific. But there was still a little bit of a change in his character, too. All right, so let's see what's going on today. So we're going to work on Henry today. Okay, here we go. Henry. While on the search for the two little girls, George had mentioned that he'd seen them earlier, looking for flowers. So when they was found dead the next day, the angry townspeople pointed to George as the last person to see them alive, and so the most likely to have killed them. Poppy's buddy Pete was a janitor at the courthouse, and he told Poppy that shortly after they brought Johnny and George into the sheriff's station for questioning, they let Johnny go. But they kept George there for hours, all by hisself. That child didn't have nobody in there with him, not his mama or his daddy, and you know, colored or not, he's supposed to have a lawyer in there with him, Poppy said. And that's still true today, right? Like you can have a lawyer in with you when you're being questioned, especially if you're a minor, which he is. He's young. So that's not okay. But they did let Johnny go. So that's good. I kept picturing George sitting behind a table in an empty room with a bunch of angry white men yelling at him telling them the same story over and over again, only to have them ask him the same questions again and again. George asking when he could go home, if he could see his parents, crying. I'd never seen George cry, but I knew he'd have been crying. I would have been crying. So remember, this is Henry. Henry is the I in this. You know what else Pete told me? Poppy was frowning at Granny and shaking his head. He said that he saw the deputy leave the station and come back with an ice cream cone. Ice cream? Granny looked puzzled. Yeah, he went on in to see George with an ice cream cone. Came out with a confession. You don't think he got George to say he did it by promising him ice cream? Granny asked. I don't know what to think. It wasn't no time later they arrested George for murder. Said he confessed to the killings, he said. There's no way George killed them girls, Myrna shouted. I know it, Myrna. I know it. Poppy went to her and put his arms around her to calm her. They made him say that, forced him, said Myrna. She sobbed into his chest and he shushed her and patted her back. It was a terrible thing for Ella to come home to. The entire town had its fur on end. White folks was mad and colored folks was scared. So when the town is fur on end, what that is like if you think about a dog, and when a dog is upset, a lot of times the fur on the back of his collar stands up straight. Okay, so that's kind of what fur on end means in this case. It's saying that like they were all at attention. They were nervous, right? And why do you think? So there's a difference here. Okay, the white folks are mad, and the colored folks are scared. So why would people of color be scared right now? And why would white people be angry? Why do you think that difference is happening? I want you to think about that. We kids were all instructed to be inside by 6 p.m. every night. If we had to go out, we were to go directly and return promptly. No dilly-dallying. That means like no playing around. And we were to absolutely not be outside after dark. It wasn't just a rule for our household, but for every colored family in the town. Every day, Poppy went into town to get more news on George. One day, after I helped Poppy load the truck up with feed at Parker's, Poppy decided to take me with him for his daily visit to see Pete at the courthouse. I waited for him in the truck, and when he came back, he was fired up, brow furrowed. You can't see my brows, but eyes and nostrils wide. We got one more stop to make, he said, and drove us to the sawmill a couple miles down. He didn't say nothing the whole ride there, and I knew better than to ask him nothing. But when we got to the mill, I hopped out and followed him. He nodded hello to the workers there, but didn't stop. Most of 'em knew Poppy, and he sure knew his way around the place. He wound through the large tables covered in lumber and quickly passed under the large machinery until we arrived near the back of the mill where George Steiny Sr. was holding a small canvas bag with tools. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and I was pretty sure he hadn't. The lines bored deep into his cheeks, and he looked up at Poppy, eyes weary. Cyrus? He only looked up a moment, then went right back to what he was doing. Oh, I wonder if Cyrus is Poppy's name. George, Pete done told me you folks is leaving. Poppy stared into his face, and even though Mr. Steiny didn't seem to have the time, the patience, or the energy to look up. They just fired me. Told me we has to get out of our cabin. Ain't got no choice. Hold on. I'm a little confused. I don't know what's going on. So I got distracted. I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread and look. Okay. So they got to the mill because they went to a sawmill. And I hopped out and followed him. So Henry hopped out and followed him. He nodded hello to the workers there, but didn't stop. Most of them knew Poppy, and he sure knew his way around the place. He wound through the large tables covered in lumber and quickly passed under the large machinery until we arrived near the back of this mill where George Steiny Sr. was holding a small canvas bag with tools. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and I was pretty sure he hadn't. The lines bored deep into his cheeks, and he looked up at Poppy, eyes weary. Okay, so that makes more sense. I thought it just said George Steiny, so it's George Steiny Sr., it's his dad. And his dad's at his work. All right, that makes more sense. Cyrus, he only looked up a moment, then went back to doing what he was doing. George, Pete done told me you folks is leaving. Poppy stared into his face, even though Mr. Steiny didn't have the time, the patience, or the energy to look up. They just fired me. Told me we has to get out of our cabin. Ain't got no choice. Most of the colored folks in Alcaloo worked in the sawmill, and the sawmill provided the families with housing. Besides, Mr. Steiny hesitated before he spoke again. He motioned Poppy to move on off to the side, out of the earshot of the white workers. It's bad, Cyrus. The Klan's been making threats. I gotta get the rest of my family out of here before something bad happens. They talking about moving George to a cell in Columbia. They're fearing if they keep him here, there'll be a lynching. Okay, who's the Klan? Do you guys know? The Klan is the Ku Klux Klan, which is a group of white supremacists that they still do it now, but like in the 40s were prevalent. They would, especially in the South, they were behind a lot of the murders of people of color. And so they kind of took the law into their own hands, and which is not okay. It's illegal, number one. But it had to be really scary, right, to hear that this group of people that kill people are coming after you and your family. So it sounds like George is George Sr. is ready to take his family to safety, the family that is not in jail. My mind was racing. So again, my is Henry. What would happen to George when they finally let him out of jail and his family wasn't in town no more? Where would he go? Would he find them? If they were afraid for their safety, maybe they wouldn't tell nobody where they went. And if they kept it a secret, George would never know how to find them. We'd take him in. Yes, of course we would. He'd come live with us until his family finally told someone where they live. Until then, George could stay in my room with me. He'd be like a big brother. We could tend the cows and the pigs together. He could teach me how to win at marbles, and I could show him all the knots I know how to tie. All of us could play kick the can. Myrna and Granny would make him peas and collards, corn and bread pudding. We'd fish in the day and find the constellations at night. When we were old enough, he'd teach me how to drive a truck. Don't worry, Mr. Steiny, I said. When George gets out, he can come stay with us. For a moment, I thought maybe I saw the beginnings of a smile in Mr. Steiny's eyes. Then, from behind us, boy, you'll just be giving us cause to bring more rope. The white workers had heard everything. They stood in a pack, glaring at us. Mr. Steinley quickly packed the last of the tools. I gotta go, he said, head bent low as he hurried out of the mill. It's pretty intense. What do you think the white workers were talking about when they said, boy, you'll just be giving us cause to bring more rope? What does that mean? What do you think? All right. It's another chapter. Should I do it? I'm just going to do it. Okay. I'm going to read one more for Henry. Ella hadn't been the same since she returned from Boston. Mind you, with George's arrest and all, it was hard to notice at first. All of our worlds had been knocked off balance, but there was something churning inside of Ella. Something she wasn't sharing, and while I'd cried for George plenty, and Myrna wasn't doing nothing but crying, I hadn't seen Ella cry once. She'd come back from Boston after less than 4 months, and there didn't seem to be any more talk of her going back. I guess Aunt Lucille had too much work to do and just couldn't manage her jobs and Ella. I knew Ella had to be plenty upset about having to come back, especially with how sudden it was. But whenever I tried to talk to her about it, she just shrugged it off and said she didn't like Boston anyway. All right, let's pause. This is a big change in the relationship between Henry and Ella, right? They share everything. So this is a huge change when we talk about characters changing and noticing. This is something I am noticing right now. But I could tell she was sad inside. She could try all she wanted to make it like it didn't bother her, but I knew Ella. I think I know Ella better than Ella knows Ella sometimes. She'd get to denying her feelings about things, trying to sweep them under the rug, but I could always see that big lumpy pile of stuff she was trying to hide, clear as day. It wasn't long before Ella went and showed all that anger she'd been holding on to. We was at recess, and she was playing jackstones with some other kids, and as usual, Ella was winning. Ella was the queen of jackstones. Anybody who knew anything knew that, but Pookie Rogers didn't know nothing. So when she came up upon Ella dominating yet another jackstones game, Pookie walked straight through the middle of the game, stepped on, and kicking away jacks. Everyone watched. Ching began shouting at Pookie. What's wrong with you? Look where you're going. You did that on purpose. The only person who didn't make a sound was Ella. Sometimes silence is worse than a lot of noise. That was the first sign of bad. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I knew she didn't like Pookie to begin with. So while everybody else was busy yelling and fussing at Pookie, I had my eyes on Ella. Still, I couldn't stop her in time. She pounced on Pookie hard and fast, took her down to the pavement, and wailed on her with all anger and frustration she'd been keeping a lid on. Everybody huddled around, most of them laughing and pointing at Pookie's exposed underwear. "Get off me!" Pookie hollered as she did her best to knock Ella's fierce assault. "Ella! Ella, stop it!" I shouted, but she couldn't hear a thing. She was lost in her fire. I jumped in and pulled her off of Pookie. I swear my cousin was darn near foaming at the mouth. Sure enough, she got suspended for the rest of the week, and she was given 2 book report assignments that she was to complete before she returned to school. Before she was let go for the day, she had to write on the board in cursive, "I will not strike another 100 times." But the worst of it was earlier, watching her have to apologize to Pookie Rogers. She did not like to apologize to anybody ever, but to have to do it to that girl who had started it all, who stood across from Ella, arms folded, gloating. Ella was shaking with rage. I saw the tears well up in her eyes as she looked at Pookie and said the words. After she turned to Principal Lacey. "May I go now?" "Yes, Ella," Principal Lacey said. Then she turned to me. "Henry, you make sure your cousin goes straight to Mr. Fowler's room." Ella and I walked out. Her nose was still flared, her eyes still glassy and thick with tears that she refused to let fall. Later, on the way home, Ella finally started talking about Boston. I think that fight had uncorked all the feelings she'd been keeping bottled up. At first, it was the same old talk about it, how it was all crowded with buildings and cars and people, a place I didn't think I'd like too much. But then she said she thought she may have made a discovery about her daddy. We found a wide tree with a nice dry patch of grassy weeds in front of it. I had a seat, leaned back, and enjoyed the apple I had left over for lunch, while Ella told me everything. "You can't tell nobody. I wasn't supposed to be snooping." She started, then proceeded to tell me about the letter she'd found in a record. The letter was postmarked 1936, from right here in Alkaloo. I was 4 in 1936. You would have been 5. Do you remember him? She tapped me on the forehead with a floppy stick of wet licorice. "No," she answered for me. "Me neither. Story goes that Mama got pregnant and he left for California before I was even born. But the same fella that wrote the letter in 1936 was the one in the studio with her. And I was in her belly when she made that recording in the studio. She told me so. J.P. He signed her record and the letter with the letter J.P. Not C.C. I smiled. "Huh?" Cab Calloway. I couldn't resist teasing her, but she was in no mood. I quickly shifted gears. "Maybe he left for California and came back," I offered. Okay, so he did. I thought about that. How come no one ever said anything about that? What's the big secret? If he's still in contact with Mama, then why ain't he in contact with me?" she asked. "Heck, maybe Granny and Poppy don't even know who he is. Maybe Mama never told them." She plopped back down on the ground next to me, chewing on her candy and talking at the same time. "Well, I don't know about that, Ella. Your ma is Granny's daughter. You don't think she saw them together before?" But Ella wasn't paying no mind at all. She seemed to like the idea of her daddy as a mystery man. "I think you should just ask Granny. She'll tell you, Ella." "I asked Granny, dummy. I know I told you that." "You did not." "Sure I did. You can't remember nothing." Ella wasn't crazy, though. There was something kind of mysterious about her daddy. No one had a photo of him. No one ever talked about him. "Too bad we can't get to some jazz joints in Charleston. Places your mama may have gone," I said. "What good would that do?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe somebody saw them together. If we could get into some clubs, we could show them a picture of your mama and see if—" She jumped up on her elbows again. "Your mama could do it. She could ask around." "But she won't. I've asked her about your daddy and she just shrugs at me. She says she doesn't know. And she And she ain't all that keen on jazz. She don't go to those clubs. I tried to think. Only person I know who likes that music around here is Mr. Parker. He does. How do you know? My mama told me. He used to go to them clubs, only white boys in there. Ain't that funny? Plus, I've heard him playing the records just before he opens up. I just had a thought. What's Mr. Parker's last name start with? P. He likes jazz. He loves Ella. Huh. I wonder. Do you think that Mr. Parker is Ella's dad? If he was a white man, that would explain why nobody wants to talk about it. Interesting. If I get there early, I could hear him in there with the phonograph cranked up. Don't nobody pass through Al Glue without visiting his store. Maybe he knows something, she said. What? Why? He's white. Besides, I think his daddy was running the shop back then. Folks say his daddy was mean. She lay back down and seemed to be silently asking the sky for advice. Word was old Mr. Parker was ornery as the devil and used to beat on his whole family for sport. Drove his sweet wife to an early grave, they said. Apparently young Mr. Parker had tried to leave once. He moved away from our small town with sights on making a new life for himself up north. When his daddy died, seeing as he didn't have anything else, he came back to run his pop's business. I shrugged. My guess is your daddy is in California. Probably came back through here at some point. No. Hold on a second. Let's go back. Apparently, young Mr. Parker had tried to leave once. He moved away from our small town with sights on making a new life for himself up north. But when his daddy died, seeing as he didn't have anything else, he came back to run his pop's business. So he left once. This kind of plays into my theory. I wonder. Okay. No, now wait, Henry. Mr. Parker just might know something. I'll bet you he knows somebody. If he's into that music, went to all them clubs in Charleston, he's got to. And maybe that somebody knows somebody else. Heck, it's worth a shot. What's worth a shot? Just the thought of Ella scheming got me nervous. Check in his office for clues. She flipped over onto her belly again and propped herself up on her elbows. See if there's any mention of a JP. How are you going to do that? I asked. I think it's better if you do it. I'm a bit distracting. I'm better at distracting folks, she said. What? I ain't going into his office. I chucked my apple core into the woods. Nuh-uh. Henry, if my daddy did come through here, he didn't come to see me. He doesn't even know about me. That ain't right. She finished her candy, and her face was still as she stared off into the distance. I'm going to find out who he is, where he is, and he's going to know me. I had to hand it to my cousin. She was never one for letting things stop her from getting where she wanted to go. If there was a tree in her road, she'd go around it. If she couldn't go around it, she'd climb over it. If she couldn't climb over it, she'd burrow a hole through it. If she couldn't do that, she'd chop the whole thing down. And like that, we are done. What do you guys think? I'm just trying to show you how much we have left. It's so funny. It's like backwards, so it's hard to do. What do you guys think? What do you think of my theory? Oh, I kind of like if she's poking around and it is Mr. Parker. Oh, Lordy, we're going to have a problem. That's for sure. All right, guys. Well, I have some predictions that I'm going to go write down in my journal because I want to make sure that when it comes true, if it's true, that I'm like, yes. And if it's not true, I could be like, well, I had some good evidence because of my characters and because of what I know. that maybe that was a possibility, right? Predictions are just things you think about. It's not necessarily true. It's just what you're thinking. Something in the words gave you a clue. All right, y'all. It's been a pleasure reading for you today. I can't wait to find out what's happening next. Myrna's next on our list of characters that we're going to read about. So here we go. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Bye.